Okay. Sleep is not, death is not, who seem to die live. House you were born in, friends of your springtime, old man and young maid, day's toil and its girderon. They're all vanishing, feeling to fables, cannot be moored. Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he's going to be important in our book. So we're going to start with just our prologue, and then we'll talk about it when we're done. So we're on page 12. I had just come to accept that my life would be ordinary when extraordinary things began to happen. The first of these came as a terrible shock, and like anything that changes you forever, split my life into halves, before and after. Like many of the extraordinary things to come, it involved my grandfather, Abraham Portman. Growing up, Grandpa Portman was the most fascinating person I knew. He lived in an orphanage, fought in wars, crossed oceans by steamship and deserts on horseback, performed in circuses, knew everything about guns and self-defense, and surviving in the wilderness. He spoke at least 3 languages that weren't English. It all seemed unfathomably exotic. It's going to be one of those days where I can't read, isn't it? To a kid who'd never left Florida. And I begged him to regale me with stories whenever I saw him. We talked about the word regale yesterday. Does anyone remember what it meant? Regale is like entertain. He wants them to entertain him. He always obliged, telling them like secrets that could be entrusted only to me. When I was 6, I decided that my only chance of having a life half as exciting as Grandpa Portman's was to become an explorer. He encouraged me by spending afternoons at my side, hunched over maps of the world, plotting imaginary expeditions with trails of red pushpins and telling me about the fantastic places I would discover one day. At home, I made my ambitions known by parading around with a cardboard tube held to my eyes, shouting, "Land ho!" and "Prepare the landing party," until my parents shooed me outside. I think they were worried that my grandfather would infect me with some incurable dreaminess in which I would never recover, that the fascinations were somehow inoculating me against a more practical ambitions. So one day, my mother sat me down and explained that I couldn't become an explorer because everything in the world had already been discovered. I'd been born in the wrong century, and I felt cheated. Is that true that everything in the world has already been discovered?
I'm doing my work actually.
Okay. I just asked a question. No, it's not true that everything in the world's already been discovered. I felt even more cheated when I realized that most of Grandpa Portman's best stories couldn't possibly be true. The tallest tales were always about his childhood, like how he was born in Poland, but when at 12 he had been shipped off to a children's home in Wales. When I would ask why he had to leave his parents, his answer was always the same, because the monsters were after him. Poland was simply rotten with him, he said. What kind of monsters? I'd ask, wide-eyed. It became a sort of routine. Awful, hunched-over ones with rotting skin and black eyes, he'd say, and they walked like this. And he'd shamble after me like an old-time movie monster until I ran away laughing. Every time he described them, he'd toss some lurid new detail. They stank like putrefying trash. They were invisible except for their shadows. A pack of squirming tentacles lurked inside their mouths and could whip out in an instant and pull you into their powerful jaws. It wasn't long before I had trouble falling asleep, my hyperactive imagination transforming to the hiss of tires on wet pavement into labored breathing just outside my window, or shadows under the door into twisting black tentacles. I was scared of the monsters, but thrilled to imagine my grandfather battling them and surviving to tell the tale. More fantastic still were his stories about life in a Welsh children's home. It was an enchanted place, he said, designed to keep kids safe from monsters, on an island where the sun shined every day and nobody got sick or died. Everyone lived together in a big house that was protected by a wise old bird, or so the story went. And as I got older, though, I began to have doubts. We're going to pause there. Why would he have had to leave his parents, like in real life? What was happening? We talked about it yesterday. In Poland and Germany and areas surrounding it that would have caused him to have to leave his parents. Sean, do you know?
World War II.
World War II. So his We'll come to find out later in the book that his parents actually had been forced into a concentration camp, and they sent him away before he could be taken in. So he went to Wales, and a lot of children end up in this home. So we're on page 14 now. What kind of bird? I asked him one afternoon at age 7, eyeing him skeptically across the card table while he was letting me win at Monopoly. A big hawk who smoked a pipe, he said. You must think I'm pretty dumb, Grandpa. He thumbed through his dwindling stack of orange and blue money. I would never think that about you, Jacob. I knew I'd offended him because the Polish accent he could never quite shake had come out of hiding. So that would become would, and think became sink. Feeling guilty, I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. But why did the monsters want to hurt you? I asked. Because we weren't like other people. We were peculiar. Peculiar how? Oh, all sorts of ways, he said. There was a girl who could fly, and a boy who had bees living inside of him, and a brother and a sister who could lift boulders over their heads. It was hard to tell if he was being serious. Then again, my grandfather was not known as a teller of jokes. He frowned, reading the doubt on my face. Fine, you don't have to take my word for it, he said. I've got pictures. He pushed back his lawn chair and went to the house, leaving me alone on the screened-in lanai, that's a porch. A minute later, he came back holding an old cigar box. I leaned in and took to look as he drew out 4 wrinkled and yellowing snapshots. The first was a blurry picture of what looked like a suit of clothes with no person in them. Either that or the person didn't have a head. Sure, he's got a head, my grandfather said, grinning. Only you can't see it. Why not? Is he invisible? Hey, look at the brain on this one. What is that? What literary device? Remember when we talked about literary devices and we talked about like irony and all the other ones? So look at the brain on this one. We watched a SNL skit about it. Starts with an S. Sarcasm. Thank you. Oh my gosh, they've cleared out my candy. I filled this up yesterday. Is indeed sarcasm. He raised his eyebrows as I'd surprised him with my powers of deduction. Millard, his name was. Funny kid, sometimes he'd say. Hey, Abe, I know what you did today. And he'd tell you where you'd been, what you'd had to eat, if you picked your nose when you thought nobody was looking. Sometimes he would follow you, quiet as a mouse, with no clothes on so you couldn't see him, just watching. He shook his head. Of all the things, eh? He slipped me another photo. Once I'd had a moment to look at it, he said, So, what do you see? A little girl. And? She's wearing a crown? He tapped the bottom of the picture. What about her feet? I held the snapshot closer. The girl's feet weren't touching the ground, but she wasn't jumping. She seemed to be floating in the air. My jaw fell open. She's flying! Close, my grandfather said. She's levitating. Only she couldn't control herself too well, so sometimes we had to tie a rope around her to keep her from floating away. My eyes were glued to her haunting doll-like face. Is it real? Of course it is, he said gruffly, taking a picture and replacing it with another. This one of a scrawny boy lifting a boulder. Victor and his sister weren't so smart, he said, but boy, were they strong. He doesn't look strong, I said, studying the boy's skinny arms. Trust me, he was. I tried to arm wrestle him once, and he just about tore my hand off. But the strangest photo was the last one. It was the back of somebody's head with a face painted on it. So the next 2 pages are pictures. One is the invisible boy, and then the girl levitating. And then you've got Victor with his boulder, and then the face painted on the back of someone's head. I stared at the last photo as Grandpa Portman explained. He had 2 mouths, you see, one in the front and one in the back. That's why he got so big and fat. But it's fake, I said. That face is just painted on. Sure, the paint's fake. It was for a circus show. But I'm telling you, he had 2 mouths. You don't believe me? I thought about it, looking at the pictures and then at my grandfather, his face so earnest and open. What reason would he have to lie? I believe you, I said. And I really did believe him, for a few years at least, though mostly because I wanted to. Like any other kids my age, I wanted to believe in Santa Claus. We cling to our fairy tales until the price for believing them becomes too high, which for me was the day in second grade when Robbie Jensen pantsed me at lunch in front of a table full of girls and announced that I believed in fairies. It was just desserts, I suppose, for repeating my grandfather's stories at school. But in those humiliating seconds, I foresaw the moniker Fairy Boy trailing me for years. And rightly or not, I resented him for it. Does anyone know what moniker means? Harley, you've got your computer up. Google the word moniker for me. Moniker. There'll be a second definition. Did you say name? Yeah, name. So moniker is just a fancy word for name. So he worried that they were going to call him Fairy Boy. And to a young, actually probably to any of you, that would be distressing. If I had a sophomore come up to me crying because people were calling him Fairy Boy, it would be a really big deal. I've never had that happen, though. Grandpa Portman picked me up from school that afternoon, as he often did when both of my parents were working. I climbed into the passenger seat of his old Pontiac and declared that I didn't believe in his fairy stories anymore. What fairy stories? He said, peering at me over his glasses. You know, the stories about the kids and the monsters. He seemed confused. Who said anything about fairies? I told him that it was a made-up story and a fairy tale were the same thing, and that fairy tales were for pants-wetting babies, and that I knew his photos and stories were fake. I expected him to get mad or put up a fight, but instead he just said, okay, and threw the Pontiac into drive. With a stab of his foot on the accelerator, we lurched away from the curb, and that was the end of it. I guess he'd seen it coming. I had to grow out of them eventually. But he dropped me off. He dropped the whole thing so quickly, it left me feeling quite like I'd been lied to. I couldn't understand why he'd made up all that stuff, tricked me into believing that extraordinary things were possible when they weren't. It wasn't until a few years later when my dad explained it to me. Grandpa had told me some of the same stories when he was a kid. And they weren't lies exactly, but exaggerated versions of the truth. Because the story of Grandpa Portman's childhood wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a horror story. My grandfather was the only member of his family to escape Poland before the Second World War broke out. He was 12 years old when his parents sent him into the arms of strangers, putting their youngest son on a train to Britain with nothing more than a suitcase and clothes on his back. It was a one-way ticket. He never saw his mother or his father again, or his older brothers or cousins, his aunts, his uncles. Each one would be dead before his 16th birthday, killed by the monsters he so narrowly escaped. But these weren't the kind of monsters that just had tentacles and rotting skin, the kind a 7-year-old might be able to wrap his mind around. They were monsters with human faces, in crisp uniforms, marching in lockstep, so banal you don't recognize them for what they are until it's too late. Like the monsters, the Enchanted Island story was also a truth in disguise. Compared to the horrors of the mainland Europe, a children's home that had taken in my grandfather must have seemed like a paradise. And so his stories had become a safe haven of endless summers and guardian angels and magical children who couldn't really fly or turn invisible or lift boulders, of course. The peculiarity for which they had been haunted was simply their Jewishness. They were orphans of war, washed up on that little island like a tide of blood. What made them amazing wasn't that they had miraculous powers. That they had escaped the ghettos and gas chambers was miracle enough. I stopped asking my grandfather to tell me stories, and I think, secretly, he was relieved. An air of mystery closed around the details of his early life. I didn't pry. He had been through hell and had the right to his secrets. I felt ashamed for having been jealous of his life, considering the price that he'd paid for it. And I tried to feel lucky for the safe and unextraordinary one that I had done nothing to deserve. Then a few years later, when I was 15, an extraordinary and terrible thing happened. And there was only before and after. Okay, we're going to stop there.